Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Social Justice Webinar Series. We are so excited that you have joined us this morning. My name is Charmaine Ward Milner, and I serve as the Director of Corporate Relations here at Georgia Power. In corporate relations, we focus on our diverse customer communities. I also have the pleasure of serving as the chair of the Social Justice Committee, which is really leading the Social Justice Initiative for Georgia Power. And I have to say, I have an amazing committee. So I just want to thank them for all of their work. So before we get started with this webinar, I want to start with a safety briefing like we always do. So please take a moment and look around you. So if you are at home, then just make sure that you look in front, behind, and on the sides, and in particular, look down at the bottom where your feet are to make sure that there's nothing obstructing you if you needed to leave. Also, I've heard that we need to make sure that we've turned the ovens and the stoves off, as some of us might be cooking and forget that we leave them on. So now if you're not at home, then we want to make sure that you look again, front, behind, left, and right, and make sure you know where all the exit signs are. So we want everyone to be safe. Again, we just want to thank you for joining us. And today we will have our Criminal Justice Equity webinar. This is the fourth webinar in a series of 6. And so with that, I want to just give you a quick overview around moving to equity, the Social Justice Initiative, and DE&I. And so starting with moving to equity. So you see the slide on the screen. You often hear this referred to as MTE. This really started back in January of 2020 when Tom Fanning, our CEO of Southern Company, announced that we wanted to address how we make decisions, our policies, our business practices to ensure there is equity in all of the critical areas of our business. And so moving to equity, or MTE, is a framework, and you see it in front of you. The 5 critical areas are talent, culture, community, political engagement, and suppliers. So think about it as a framework by which all of these critical areas, we are looking at everything that we do and how we do it to ensure there's equity in these areas. Now, let's focus on the community commitment. Underneath that particular commitment, there has been an investment commitment made of $225 million over 5 years to advance racial equity and social justice, specifically in distressed and disadvantaged communities. And that is where we have the Social Justice Initiative. So this community commitment under moving to equity is what we're talking about when we talk about the Social Justice Initiative. So let's go to the next slide. So now the Social Justice Initiative is made up of 4 pillars. And actually it started with 3 pillars, but now it's 4. Can we advance the slide? And I just want to make sure that you know that it is not by happenstance how we came up with these pillars. That probably 18 months ago, there was a cross-system committee formed that looked at where were the areas where there was the most disparity, where was there most gap in these disadvantaged and distressed communities, and where could the resources of a Southern Company be used the most to close these gaps. And so what we came up with was 3 pillars initially. It was education equity, criminal justice equity, and economic empowerment. And then just recently, in the last month or so, we've added energy justice. So when we're talking about social justice initiative, we're talking about these 4 social justice pillars. And this is where we're going to look at where we make our investments, specifically around these focus areas. Excuse me. So I just want to take you, if you could go back, please. I just want to walk you through very quickly these 4 pillars. So education equity is the entire pipeline of the beginning of education with early childhood through K-12. We're looking at math programs, reading programs, STEAM programs, all the way through higher ed, specifically around HBCUs and even PWIs, which are primarily white institutions that have a large majority of minority students. In addition to that, looking at internships and career opportunities. So we want to invest in nonprofit nonprofit organizations that have initiatives and programs that align with any of these areas around education equity. When you move to criminal justice equity, which is what we're going to spend our time on today, again, we're looking at the entire kind of 360. So first, we want to prevent individuals from even getting involved in the criminal justice system. So we want to invest in youth and juvenile programs, as well as pre-arrest programs. So when someone does get arrested, they do have the opportunity, the police have the opportunity to send them to a pre-arrest or diversion program. But we need more of these programs, and we need to have the police and others trained to know more about these programs that are out there. So that way they don't go to jail or go to prison, they go to a pre-arrest or diversion program where they can get the assistance that they need. We also want to focus on re-entry programs where they do training and they do wraparound services to really help individuals that do serve their time when they come back out to be trained so they can be thriving citizens and get jobs, because that's really at the end of the day what we want, because that will help our economy, that will help just have thriving communities. And then we want to provide some investment for our responders, making sure that they have the training they need and they know how to de-escalate situations. When we go to economic empowerment, this is really the bigger pillar. It includes two different areas. One is around entrepreneurship, and the second is around communities. So I want to talk about entrepreneurship first. We want to invest in those organizations and those initiatives that help our small minority, even micro businesses, right? So that they can build capacity, so that they have access to capital, so that they have access to training around financial literacy and budgeting, all these different things that they need to really grow their businesses. And what we do know is that most of the growth in new jobs is coming from our small businesses. And most of the small businesses are from minority, either brown and Black communities, right, who are starting these small businesses. But most of the new job growth is coming from those. We also want to make sure that we are investing in our communities, and whether that's affordable housing or infrastructure, we want to make sure that we have thriving communities. And then finally, energy justice. And here we're looking at energy burden. How can we really invest in programs so that we can reduce energy burden? And that is when individuals pay a significant amount of their income to pay for their energy. Also want to invest in those programs to help individuals that need assistance paying their energy bill. We want to make sure all communities have access to energy efficiency programs and weatherization programs. And then we move down to just transition. This really is about e-transportation, that everyone has access to e-cars, and ensuring that we're continuing to invest in programs that will make it more affordable to have e-cars. And if you have an e-car, that there are chargers in all of the communities, because if you don't have a charger available, it doesn't do you a lot of good to have an e-car. But even having e-buses for our public school system, we just want to make sure that we're investing in those initiatives that provide access, in addition to job training in energy careers and sustainability careers. And then finally, around environmental justice, and that is investing in those disadvantaged communities that might be what we call on our fence line, and that is any community that is adjacent to one of our assets, and whether that is a headquarters or a substation or a generation plant, and making sure that we invest in them and that they are benefiting from benefiting from the adjacent, as opposed to having any disadvantage. We also want to make sure that we're investing in what we call frontline communities, and those communities are those that are right in the path of critical weather. And so think about it like coastline communities, right? So making sure that we're investing in those communities. And so these are the 4 social justice pillars. So when you think about investments, whether it is 426, whether it's foundation, whether it's volunteering, mentoring, serving on boards, these are the areas that we really want to focus on. And again, these areas were picked very specifically because we know that if we invest in these areas, that we can change the trajectory of some of these communities. And so what is that investment? So initially, from a Southern Company perspective, you can go to the next slide, this was $225 million over 5 years. For Georgia Power, what that means is $87 million over 5 years. And you can see in the graphic how those dollars are allocated. So when we look at an annual perspective, it's about $18 million. Now, for my math majors out there, I know you're saying, well, 18 times 5, it doesn't add up. You're right, because we just added the energy justice pillar, and we won't begin investing in that until 2022. So these are the investments that we are making as it relates to social justice that we want to make and throughout the 5 years. And we also invested and made a commitment to invest not just cash, we also want to invest our employees. We want to engage our employees, and we want to do that through mentorship. So one of the things that Southern Company committed was to 5,000 employee mentors annually. And what that means for Georgia Power is 250 employee mentors annually. And you'll be hearing more about that when we have our mentor webinar on November 18th. So make sure you mark that, as well as the other webinar we have on November 17th. So now that we understand what the investment is, we understand how we got here, what the four social justice pillars are. I just want to take a quick moment because there have been some questions about how does it all tie in. And so if we can have the next slide. So I want you just to think about moving to equity, or MTE, as that framework, right? Almost like an umbrella. Again, it is those business practices and policies for how we will ensure we have equity in all of our critical parts of our business. Now, when you look at social justice, that is our external commitment. And that is part of moving to equity. Remember, it was the community commitment. That is what social justice is. And that's that investment of $87 million or $18 million annually for Georgia Power. Now, when we think about DE&I, this is also part of moving to equity, but this is the internal side. So this is really us wanting to put things in play and practices and procedures and education and awareness so that we have a culture where we are inclusive and where we're embracing diversity and celebrating our differences. So I mean, this is a very simplistic kind of graphic, but just wanted you to see how it all ties together. So think about social justice as external and DE&I as internal, and all of it is part of our moving to equity, or MTE. But with that, if you want to get more information, please visit, the link to the website is below at the bottom of the slide. And I just want to now take you so that you can hear from Chris Womack, our CEO of Georgia Power, because he really talks about our social justice commitment in a way that I never could do it justice.
At Georgia Power, we believe it's our responsibility to be an active champion of the communities we serve. That's why we're excited to stand with our communities to tackle systemic equity issues across our state. We're committing $87 million to address these issues over the next 5 years, focusing on supporting and partnering with organizations that assist with education equity, criminal justice, energy justice, and economic empowerment. And we're building a team of more than 250 employees who will serve as mentors to our state's young people, helping shape Georgia's future leaders. This financial investment and our commitment to mentoring, while just a part of our overall equity efforts, are one way we can make a real impact in distressed and disadvantaged communities and continue to be a champion for all Georgians.
Thank you, Chris. And with that, I'd like to now turn it over to our amazing moderator that we have for today, Doug Jenkins, Region VP of the West Region. So Doug, it's all yours.
Thank you, Charmaine. Really super excited to have a chance to moderate this panel today and really have a chance to talk about a subject that I have been personally involved with for several years, even before Georgia Power identified this as a pillar for our social justice efforts that Charmaine just described. As a matter of fact, my involvement started as I noticed the troubling criminal justice trends on our community development efforts across the state. And really what I heard through participating in mentorship programs in communities about the overwhelming impact on our minority communities that was surfacing because of our criminal justice efforts. Heartbreaking stories that impacted me to the core on the impact, not just to the individuals that I was working with in those mentorship programs, but to their families and their communities. So it's been a subject that I've been engaged in ever since. And that brings me immediately to answering the most common question that I'm asked when talking about Georgia Power's involvement in criminal justice with employee groups across the company. And that is something like this: Doug, Georgia Power has been involved in the other areas of our social justice pillars for many years: education, economic empowerment, energy. I clearly see how these areas fit our mission of being a citizen wherever we serve. But how does criminal justice fit with these other areas? And for our panelists and our other external guests that are with us today, let me pause here and say Georgia Power has had as our foundation for more than 100 years the motto of being a citizen wherever we serve. And that means to us that we focus first and foremost on building up the communities in this state. We work with individual communities to help them make sure they have great education programs, great transportation options, affordable housing, great parks, economic development strategies, and so forth. And when communities gain this foundation, what do you think happens next? This leads to higher quality of life, economic development opportunities, jobs, a great place to live, work, and play. And then what else? Stable and increasing energy usage. Yes, energy usage. But notice that I ended there with energy usage. I didn't start there. It's the end product of focusing on our communities first and foremost. And this is in our DNA and makes our company very, very unique across this state. So back to my point of education, economic empowerment and energy equity being very easily connected to our focus on being a citizen wherever we serve. But what about criminal justice? The main thing that I hope you see today in this webinar, and if you only remember one thing, I hope this is it, is that criminal justice is just as significant in sustaining and building up our communities as these other pillars. So let's dive in and let me show you what I mean by that. I thought about using multiple slides today to showcase some key stats. I'm not going to do that to you. So I decided just to share a few key points to kind of get us started with a foundation. There'll be plenty of time for slides later. So first, what is criminal justice? When you hear that term, what I want you to think about is it's kind of the intertwining of agencies, processes, and laws which seek to achieve kind of three things. Minimization of crime. That means keeping folks out of the criminal justice system, if at all possible. Second is imposition of penalties for those that commit crimes, proper penalties. And third, the rehabilitation and return to society of those who commit a crime. So that's kind of what we're talking about, that whole pipeline. So how are we doing in criminal justice in this country? So I want you to consider the following. The U.S., our country, has 5% of the world's population. So you would think that we would probably have roughly 5% of the world's criminals, right? But we have 20% of the world's prisoners. 2.3 million individuals are incarcerated in the United States. And the country has another 4.5 million on probation or parole. So that's a total of 7 million people under some type of correctional control in this country, way above what other nations have. And then get this, even when you're out of prison or you're no longer on probation or parole, you have a criminal record. We have 77 million individuals in this country that have a criminal record. That's 25% of adults in this country. So when you're driving around in your community and you see all those signs out about employment opportunities and job opportunities, I want you to have a different perception on that there are a lot of folks that are unemployed or underemployed because of having those criminal records. And that's a big deal for those families. So now let's bring this a step closer to home and talk about Georgia. So how many of you on this call think Georgia is doing better or worse than the U.S. average on criminal justice statistics? I mean, we're better at everything, right? I mean, that's usually when I'm in a room and I ask for that, about half the room says we're doing, better. The other half, says, well, probably worse or about the same. But would you believe that Georgia is last, and not in a good way, on many key criminal justice statistics? So when it comes to correctional control, those folks in prison, parole, or probation, our state's rate is a little over 5,000. It's 5,143 individuals per 100,000 residents that are in correctional control, which is more than double the national average of 2,045 individuals. As a matter of fact, we're about 40% higher on correctional control rates in this state than the next closest state in the nation, which is Pennsylvania. So when you look at that staggering impact in Georgia, that translates into 40% of adults in this state have some type of criminal record compared to 25% in the US. So you hear all the time that we're the number one state to do business. We have lots of jobs moving into this state. So I want you to think about the impact of all those Georgians that might not be able to get those jobs because of criminal records in their past. And what will be the impact on jobs continuing to move into this state with that type of impact? Big deal. So let me pause here and mention one other item. Need to mention this one, and I need you to really pause yourself, and I want you to think about this. You can't talk about criminal justice without talking about racial impacts. You cannot do it. I want you to consider the following. The likelihood of imprisonment for a male U.S. resident born in 2001 is 1 in 9 that they will end up in prison. 1 in 9. All right, that's staggering. But I want you to listen to this. For white males, it's 1 in 17. For black males, it's 1 in 3. So 1/3 of black males born in 2001 will be in prison. All right, that's a staggering statistic. For Latino males, it's 1 in 6. So if that doesn't give you pause and hit you right in the heart, nothing else will. All the impacts that I have discussed about how these individuals and families are being impacted is concentrated in the Black and Latino community. So again, think about the impact on these individuals, families, and communities. For women, the statistics are the same trend. For female U.S. residents, the likelihood of imprisonment is 1 in 56. For white females, that's 1 in 111. For black females, it's 1 in 18. And for Latina females, 1 in 45. So not only do we have overall issues in this state that need to be addressed in our criminal justice system, we also have obvious equity issues to address. So back to the points that I made at the very beginning of the webinar. How is criminal justice related to Georgia Power's focus on being a citizen wherever we serve, and why is it part of our social justice strategy? I hope you can see through some of those stats I just shared the tremendous impact that this area is having on individuals, families, and communities across this state. When 40% of Georgia adults have some type of criminal record, our ability to work on workforce in local communities and attract the jobs of the future, our ability to help communities achieve higher quality of life for its citizens when so many of them are held back, and the racial inequities in the current system are having big impacts on the state. That's why we've added criminal justice as one of our social justice pillars. So let me share one story before I jump in and introduce the panelists. A lot of you in your minds, when you think about criminal justice, you're thinking about serious violations, folks that might have, violent crimes such as murder or something being in prison. Let me tell you, the majority of folks in the criminal justice system are there for very technical violations. I want you to think of an individual driving home from work. You can insert your name in this, but let's call him Bob. He's driving home from work. he has a broken tail light. All right, gets pulled over, gets a ticket. That ticket, he's planning on appearing in court in a couple of weeks to address that ticket. The court date gets moved, or he misplaces the ticket. He doesn't show up in court. The minute that happens, his license is suspended. All right, doesn't know that. He's not notified about that. So Bob's driving around with a suspended license. Let's say he's driving home from work a little bit, a couple of weeks later, and he goes through a four-way stop, maybe doesn't stop all the way, and he's pulled over. Well, he's pulled over now on a suspended license. Bob goes to jail. So, and let's say he doesn't have the ability to pay all the fines and fees associated with that suspended license. And he's probably also going to lose his job because he can no longer drive to work. He's now in the system with very little ways to get out. That's the type of folks I want you to think about that are in the system and being impacted by a lot of these policies. Now, I painted a broad picture of criminal justice. What can we do to make the situation better? Luckily, we have some great partners across this state that have worked both locally and across the nation to move the needle on criminal justice improvements for many years. And we have several of these great partners on our panel today, including Doug Amar, CEO of Georgia Justice Project. We have Adam Gelb, the CEO of Council on Criminal Justice, Michael Waller, the CEO of Georgia Appleseed, and Pamela Nguyen, the CEO of Restore Her. Our company is working with partners just like these experts across the state to come up with strategies to focus on the criminal justice areas that Charmaine just went over in our social justice slide: prevention, community intervention, reentry into society, training for first responders, and criminal justice policy. We are helping develop these strategies just like we have done for education initiatives, economic empowerment initiatives, transportation initiatives, and others for decades. And we hope to use our business connections to encourage other corporations to engage in this important area when they understand the future impacts on their business, their customers, and their local communities. So let me transition into our panel of experts now that have worked in this area for many, many years. So I'm going to start with the questions now. And before I do, first and foremost, it's an honor to be with you guys today and have you help us further unpack this topic of criminal justice. Thanks to each of you for joining us, for the work that your organization does in this space, and for your personal commitment to this space. As you've heard in my opening comments, Georgia Power employees have a good understanding of education, economic empowerment, and energy equity, which our company's been involved in for decades, but criminal justice is new to us. So can you take a moment to introduce yourself and your organization and then give us your definition of criminal justice? And Adam, if you don't mind, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Doug. I assume I'm off mute. Terrific. And before I just kick in, can I just applaud you, Doug, and Charmaine and others there for your commitment to this issue and taking it on this issue. It is essential to the well-being of our communities, as the other issues you've been involved for a long time, and it's just a really potentially powerful thing that Georgia Power Southern Company is stepping into this area. So I'm Adam Gelb. I'm CEO of the Council on Criminal Justice. I'm here in Atlanta. We're a national organization. If you think of the sort of spectrum of organizations on the work in criminal justice, you have that are represented here today. We have some organizations that work on direct services, some that work as part of the legal process of the system, and then ours is sort of on the other end of that spectrum as a policy organization. We work with our membership, or invitational membership organization, and a nonpartisan think tank. And our mission is to build consensus for policies, practices, and programs that will enhance safety and justice for all. And we do that in a number of different ways, but chiefly through putting our members together in task forces and asking them to come up with findings and recommendations that comport with the research and with the direct and lived experience of people in the system. And so we're proud of where we've come in the 2.5 years we've been in existence, and particularly on the piece of here that we have about building a platform that that says that policies should not just be made by people with fancy titles at the top of organizations, but they should be sitting around a table like we do at our task forces with people who have been through the system and know the kind of situations that Doug just referenced, and can make sure that we've got a level playing field and got the right voices at the table. There's much more to say about it, but I'll shift to the question, Doug, about criminal justice. As I think about what might be most helpful for employees at this stage is to just really emphasize that we often call it the criminal justice system, but it is not a system at all. It is not a system in any way, shape, or form. It is a disjointed, fragmented process that is designed and was designed intentionally to be that way, and to be adversarial. Actually, you think about it. I won't pretend to know the business of energy, but my sense is that the energy business and your company is structured so from beginning to end, from the generation of power to the delivery of that power to customers, everything's coordinated. And these people talk to these people who talk to these people all along that spectrum, so that things can be done most efficiently and effectively. Think about the opposite in the criminal justice system, where very few people talk to each other, and they're often opposed to each other. Think about defense lawyers and prosecutors. Think about the police having their role in the system, which is very distinct from not only the prosecution and what happens in the courts, but then what happens in corrections. Kind of everybody's doing their own thing along the way. And it's been actually fairly recent notion that there should be even policy in the system. And I'll make this one point, which is that up until probably about 15, 20 years ago, the prison population and the size of the prison population was really just something that everybody accepted, because the criminal justice process was, well, you have individual people committing individual crimes, the police arrest them, the courts sort out whether this person should or shouldn't go to prison for how long. And then when they send them to the state just needs to say, okay, well, how many are we going to need this year? How many are we going to need that year? And it's a relatively recent development that people are starting to say, now, wait a second. You realize we got to a point where we have 2.3 million people in prison. That's 1 out of every 100 adults in this country. And we need to actually start figuring this out in a way to bend that curve back down and get to a more reasonable place while also staying safe.
Thank you, Adam, very much. And I appreciate you. I really appreciate the reference back to how the power grid, operates. That'll help our employees kind of understand the criminal justice system compared to how we do things. So I appreciate that very much. Pamela, how about you? Let's go to you next.
Good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you all for inviting me here. I am Pamela Nguyen. I am the founder and director of Restore Her US America. We are a policy advocacy reentry organization that's led by and for justice-involved women here in the Southern region. And we also do work on a national level. We basically address the social determinants of criminalization and the social inequities for women who are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated, to protect their dignity and safety, with a focus on incarcerated pregnant women. For me, as someone who have lived experience serving a 78-month federal prison sentence for a white-collar crime, of which my judge recommended home confinement, also being a woman, also being Black, also being from the South, and also being pregnant while I was incarcerated and shackled, which caused me to fall and caused the demise of my baby, and then being placed in solitary confinement, along with a lot of other things. Criminal justice, basically what my experience is not justice. It is a process, a system of processes that are founded out of patriarchy, racism, sexism, classism, and have evolved from slavery into Jim Crow, into the mass incarceration of the prison industrial complex system, which we are all enduring now, and also an dramatic increase of incarcerating women of color in our nation. And something that needs to be abolished, the entire system that we're founded on, and be regrouped based on rehabilitation and dignity for those to hold themselves accountable and be responsible for mistakes that they have made.
Thank you, Pamela, very much. Michael, let's go to you.
Thank you. My name is Michael Waller. I'm with the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. I'm going to tell you a little bit about us and answer your question. But first, I want to thank Pamela and Adam. It's always a privilege to be on a panel like this with y'all and folks like you. And also, Doug, thank you for the opportunity, and thank everybody out there for listening, for tuning in, because really the first step in all of this is educating yourself and learning more, right? Realizing there is a problem. I also want to thank Pamela for sharing that, because it is really critical. And it's for her, to share her personal story. It's critical for us to remember that, there's a lot of people, and as Doug pointed out, it's shocking. The numbers are shocking, but each one of those folks suffered while they were incarcerated. It was not a benign, some period of their life that was benign. It did most of them great harm, actually, and so folks don't come out of that system better than they went in, and that harm can happen in lots of different ways. It can not only be psychological, but physical, as Pamela pointed out, and have long-reaching implications for families and communities as well. So I work for the Georgia Appleseed Center for Law and Justice. We're a nonprofit law center. We're based in Atlanta, but we're statewide, and we try to represent communities from around the state. We were founded in 2005. We've been doing this for a while, and we were founded by the Georgia legal community, and trying to create an organization that could go out and really go after big systemic reform, bring people together to talk about how do we reform the systems that are perpetuating injustices in the state, particularly injustices on children. And so over the years, we've worked on projects like rewriting the Juvenile Justice Code, trying to drive down discipline rates in Georgia, drive down juvenile incarceration and arrest rates in order to prevent juveniles from entering the criminal justice system. So we do our work in kind of a number of ways, but there are three sort of main components to the work that we do. But first of all, let me tell you, to do these three things, we focus on kind of big outcomes, and the big outcomes for us right now are what we call dismantling the school to prison pipeline. And I'll probably have a chance to talk to you a little bit more about that later. That's basically keeping kids in class and out of the juvenile justice system, because the stats show and lived experience show that when you kick kids out of school, you really increase their risk of entering the criminal justice system as juveniles and staying there as adults. It has big impacts on their family too. Second thing is getting kids the supports they need while they're in school to succeed. So behavioral health for children. Behavioral health is as common as a school lunch. That's what it should be in Georgia. And other supports, restorative practices, those kinds of things that help kids kind of learn from one another, deal with one another instead of engaging in conflict, and also are more successful at improving discipline and making schools safer than other techniques. And then finally, ensuring that families, low-income families in particular, in Georgia have access to stable, safe, healthy housing, because without that, kids are really at risk at not succeeding at school, also kind of getting in trouble at school, and other problems. This stat, it just kills me. Prior to COVID-19, 24% of the kids in the state that entered foster care did so because of inadequate housing. Think about that. That's many, many thousands of kids every year who are at risk of being removed from their families because of inadequate housing. It's very important to us. And for us, there's a direct tie between that and the criminal justice system itself. So your question, though, so what is criminal justice equity? So I'm going to build on, you talked about criminal justice and equity. I'm going to build on what Pamela and Adam said. And for me, there's a couple of things when you think about equity. The first thing is that, identity should not be inevitability. In other words, because you're live in poverty, or because you're a child who has questions about their identity, or you are a Black boy in Georgia, that should not define what's going to happen to you when you show up at school. I mean, that's crazy. Kids wake up every morning, right? They're the most optimistic among us, and they know that it's going to be a great day. Like, they're going to learn to fly that day. They're going to be the best kid ever. They're going to do great at school. I mean, they're going to be a superhero. And then as they move through their morning, there are obstacles and barriers that we put in their way, And some of these kids know, right? By the time they get to school, they're going to get in trouble that day. Like, something's going to happen, right? So when I think about equity, I think about a couple things. One, it doesn't have to be this way. That's something to sort of remember, that the stats that Doug put out there, it's not inevitable. Like, we don't have to have a system like this. That's really important. But the equity part comes in where those of us who are not in the criminal justice system, and those of us who have low risk of being in the criminal justice system, and those of us who have a role to play in changing it, we bear some responsibility for it. In other words, it's not just about the people who are in the system, quote unquote, in the system. It's about the rest of us. And I want to talk a little later about, from our perspective, our organization focuses on children and school discipline and juvenile justice and its role in the overall criminal justice system. And it's really important to remember that these kids are often put into the school to prison pipeline because of decisions that adults make, not because of what they're doing. So for me, equity kind of centers on those things. And I always at the end have to say, focus on the children and the families, because for us, that's where it all starts.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. And I hope everybody can see the passion that all of these folks have for what their organizations stand for, and really making a difference in this space. Our fourth panelist, I think, Doug Amar, who, by the way, who has the favorite, my first name of any of the panelists, the other Doug. We're having technical difficulties with him right now. I don't think he is on the line. Is that correct? All right. Once we're able to kind of work through that, then we'll have Doug come in and introduce himself. So with that, I'm going to move into kind of the next question, and this is, we've had several questions come in from the chat, and they're about some of the national trends that we're seeing in the U.S. from the criminal justice system. So, which just so happens to be our second questions, and I think we'll be able to hit most of these. So, as we think about the entire criminal justice pipeline that we've described, what are some of the most troubling trends from a national perspective? And how did we get to this point as a country? So help us with some historical context there. And so I know, Adam, you guys spend a lot of time in this space. So let me start with you on this question.
Sure. So a couple different ways to approach it, and I am not going to try to compete at all with the explanation that Pamela gave just a few minutes ago, right? Tracing the history of the country and the growth of these systems over time. That's an undeniable part of the reasons why we are where we are. There are other sort of just more mechanical reasons for what's happened with the underpinnings of that narrative, and it was sort of really a perfect storm of things that happened coming out of the 1960s and the social unrest in that period, and political strategies that said where there was a general feeling, and it was a feeling that was across both political parties, both Democrats and Republicans were part of running up punishment levels and saying we needed to have more policing, we needed to have more punishment per crime. And so it is right in the early 70s that you start to see the rise in the prison population. And that was due to expansion of policing and greater likelihood of people going to prison, and then when you go to prison, staying longer. And that's a combination of the various laws and policies that were passed in the states and at the federal level. There's a really important part of this story, Doug, that I want to tell, because it debunks, I think, a common part of this narrative it feels important. It feels important now that Joe Biden is president, and that is that the 1994 federal crime bill was a big culprit in all of this. And there's no question that the 94 crime bill sort of put the imprimatur of the federal government and the presidency at that point on the notion that there ought to be more punishment in response, particularly to violent crime. But the fact of the matter is that the vast majority of the prison growth had occurred before that 1994 crime bill, and that the actual rate of prison growth slowed in the wake of the 94 crime bill. So, for folks that don't work on this day in and day out and sort of see and hear things, the notion that the 94 crime bill is the answer. Why do we have this problem? Well, there was this awful bill that was passed then. Is really not a big part of the answer at all. I could talk about the other causes, but just in deference to others here, I'd like to shift quickly to the trends. And I got to say, things are still, if you look at if the metric is what's our incarceration rate compared to other countries, and what are the trends, I just say they're still at appalling levels and way out of whack for where we have been historically in this country. It wasn't until the early 70s that I mentioned that for 50 years before, from the 1920s to the 1970s, the incarceration rate in the country was basically flat, despite all of the other things that were going on through that period of wars and recessions and other things. And then you see that rise. But prison population and the incarceration rate in this country peaked now about 12 years ago in 2009 at 2.3 million. We unfortunately don't have an official national count for what the year-end population was at the end of 2020, but it's likely to be somewhere between 1.8 and 1.9 million people. And that's still appallingly high, but if we have 500,000 fewer people behind bars than we did 12 years ago, that's an important step in the right direction. I also want to highlight that another trend in racial disparities, because I think it's just really important for people to not view these problems as completely intractable, right? These are problems that we can do something about, and that various things are being done about by the organizations represented on your panel here today in Georgia and across the country. So in addition to the sort of overall drop in the incarceration rate in the population, we've seen a narrowing of some of these racial disparities. Let me give you a couple numbers. The black-white prison disparity rate has gone from about 8-to-1 to 5-to-1. The imprisonment rate of blacks to whites for drug offenses has dropped from 15-to-1 in about 2000 down to 5-to-1, so a drop of about 2/3. And then the black-white disparity for women has dropped from about 6-to-1 to 2-to-1. So those last two, those are drops of 2/3, 15 to 5-to-1 for drug offenses and 6-to-2 for women. There's still, if you were to say to somebody that blacks are imprisoned at a rate 5 times higher than whites, nobody thinks that's acceptable, and much more work needs to be done. I do think it's important to recognize and to try to unpack, well, why has it come down by 2/3? What is changing with respect, particularly to how the criminal justice system is behaving, to what the police may or may not be doing, what the courts, what corrections, what parole may not be doing, that would explain these things. And that's something that we are particularly focused on here at the council. We want to draw attention to the fact that there are still egregious disparities, but understand why things are moving in the direction that they are, so that we can accelerate the things that are helping narrow these disparities, and we can call out and try to work on the bottlenecks and the obstacles.
Thank you, Adam, very much. Appreciate you pointing out too that especially at the very beginning of your answer, that folks tend to go and look at criminal justice and they're looking for one thing that happened, one item that causes all these disparities, and that just doesn't exist. This is a very complicated, disconnected process, and you have to really dig into multiple areas to try to figure this out. And I also agree with you that we are making progress. We got a long way to go, but you really have to look at a lot of these states, national trends, and try to understand what these folks are doing to head things in the right direction, so that we can continually expand these best practices out to other folks. So,
Right.
Pamela,
Doug, can I just jump? Sorry, let me just
absolutely,
jump in.
Yeah.
With one more piece that's really important, I think, at the beginning of a discussion for you and the company about this, and that's the word discretion. If there's one thing that really characterizes this criminal justice process or system, it's that there is discretion at almost every point along the way here. There's discretion in the traffic stop scenario that you talk about. Does that officer arrest or not arrest that person? And even if there's a policy in place, it's always subject to interpretation on the spot. And on, literally at every point along this. And so if there's a sense, particularly from a corporate perspective, that well, there's somebody in charge at the top of this thing, and maybe that's the president, or maybe it's the governor who can say this is what's going to happen at every point along the way. There's certainly laws and policies, but holy cow, if even the tightest ones still don't have a lot of discretion, and even if they do, like mandatory minimums, say this is thou shalt do something, that generally pushes discretion to other parts of the system, and so you have thousands of actors and thousands of different agencies all along the pipeline here, and trying to get them all to sort of move in one direction in common at a time is very different from a corporate environment.
Well said. Thank you, sir. Pamela, it was really hard. It's going to be really hard to beat your introduction when you talked about the history and how we kind of got here. So but I want to give you and Michael a chance to add anything to Adam's comments, and give us your thoughts on some of the troubling trends from a national perspective and how we got to this point. So Pamela, Let's start with you.
Sure. So like Adam said, I do agree that there are so many moving parts to this thing. There's just not one culprit that got us here. There are a number of things. And so I'll speak on, in addition to the things that I started out with, Amendment 13 being a part of that process. And with Amendment 13, it basically gave an loophole, you would say, for states to go back into slavery and free, working for free, not having to pay folks for their services due to the emancipation when folks were freed. Now we had all these big farms and things going on. We had nobody to work them. And so we created Amendment 13. And in addition to Amendment 13, it has evolved again into the prison industrial complex, where we have these private prisons and other entities, even small counties, that benefit and make money off of people being incarcerated. So we have moved into, along with 1994, when we passed all these mandatory tough on crime bills to punish people and incarcerate folks. We added to that because now we are warehousing people, because the more folks we have incarcerated, the more free labor we get and the more money this system drums up for these private prisons and other things and so on. And now it's gotten to a point where, as we know now, women have gotten caught up into the mill as well and are the highest rate to be incarcerated right now. And what it has caused, along with my work, is we have pregnant women now who we see stories every day who are delivering babies in cells by themselves, losing babies, even dying themselves. And now to add to that, we have COVID. So we have all these people in these small spaces with this pandemic and so many other things going, and just, so these are the trends that we see continuously now nationally. And also, like Adam said, these are things that we can rectify. There are things that can be fixed. We created them, we're able to fix them. It's just a matter of us doing it.
Well said, Pamela. And to add on to what you said about kind of what's happened in history, if you think about too where Georgia started, which was a debtor colony. So we started as really a prison colony. And so we've got a lot of state history built around the criminal justice system on top of that too. So thank you for that. Michael, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I'll talk, shift the subject a little bit back to the schools, because sometimes the schools function a little bit like a third criminal justice system. Let me explain that because it sounds kind of shocking to people. Most people don't know that the schools, when you have certain types of allegations against kids, they have a right to a tribunal. So if you're going to kick a kid out of school, suspend a child for a certain number of days, child has the right to a tribunal, which is like a mini court in the school. And so the kids kind of go through this system, and then through that tribunal system, they're expelled or suspended, and so that has a big impact then on their juvenile justice risk. It kind of goes through the roof, and for some populations, it gets even more serious. The implications are really even more immediate. So for a child in foster care, for example, if you are suspended or expelled, often that means your home placement has to move too. So because your foster parents work, they can't take you someplace, to school, they can't put you in alternative school, something like that, or stay with you at home. And so you often have to find a new home placement. And every time the home placement changes, the child gets farther and farther behind in school, and also their risk of justice involvement increases. So by the time you hit 5 moves, which is quite common actually, we represent kids all the time who have 5 moves, then your risk of going into the juvenile justice system hits 90%. 90%. So once you enter foster care, your chance of graduating is about 37%. You're also 75% likely to be behind grade in terms of your learning, and then on top of that, with every move, your chance of going in the criminal justice system increases. So the schools kind of can serve as a way to funnel kids into the system, sometimes unwittingly. I want to talk a little, I want to explain that a little bit, and then I want to talk about these trends because they're important. I don't want to take up too much time with this, but just so people sort of understand how this works. Like Adam said, and like Pamela said, there's some basic mechanics here. There's a long history. What's somewhat unique about the way that schools approach discipline is that a lot of us here on the call probably can remember it being different at school. And that's really important to focus on. That a lot of us, maybe all of us on the call, didn't grow up with police in our schools. We didn't go up through metal detectors, and when kids got in trouble, it was often considered age appropriate somehow and dealt with by the school, even if it involved like fighting or minor theft, those sorts of things. So things have changed dramatically. So to get to your first part, Doug, about the history, the history of the schools is a little different from the history that Pamela and Adam sketched out, but it does track starting in the 90s very closely to what was happening with our criminal justice system. So again, there was a focus on criminal justice. There was a increasing focus on zero tolerance. We had some school shootings. We also had kind of a general mood in the country about criminal justice and what was supposed to be happening with criminal justice. And so we developed these policies at schools. We sort of created the idea of the super predator, and we began to see schools as a place that needed to be locked down and protected from within and from without. And it's important to remember and have a little situational awareness about schools. Schools can be bright, sunny places for people, but they're not a place you can choose to leave. So there is a carceral sort of element to schools that you just can't get around. Like, you got to acknowledge that. So you got to be aware. And let me just explain how it can play out for a kid, the mechanics of it, if you have sort of these zero tolerance policies and lots of discretion, as Adam pointed out. So if you're a child and you wake up in the morning and you didn't get enough sleep the night before, or you get up in the morning and you're taking care of your siblings, which is very, very common in Georgia. There's a lot of kids in Georgia who take care of their siblings in the mornings because the parents in their lives, or the adults in their lives, aren't capable or won't, right? Just for one reason or another. Some of these kids don't sleep well at night. Some kids are sleeping out on a stoop, frankly, at night. Some sleeping in rough housing. But they get up in the morning, they've got responsibilities that are pretty grown up. They've also got to get themselves to school. They get to school, and there's a wonderful poem that lays this out beautifully, but they get to school and they've made some minor mistake. Like, for example, in the poem, and forgive me, I can't remember the author's name, the child forgets a pencil, for example, and you're supposed to bring your pencil to school, or hasn't done the homework. The child immediately gets in trouble for that. So the child, let's say that goes over okay. Well, that starts the day pretty poorly, and the child's like the rest of us, By the time 2 or 3 things like that happen during the day and they're already exhausted, they get frustrated and they may respond in a way that's considered defiant. So then now you've got a discipline problem, and that escalates throughout the day until finally maybe the kid loses it, just like any of us would. There's a number of mistakes along the way that adults have made, and it helps create this situation where you have now a big discipline problem. And really a large number of children in the state, a large percentage of the tens of thousands of kids, the 6% of children every year who are suspended and expelled from Georgia's schools, is because of things like defiance. It's not because of violent behavior. And so schools and the state needs to get better at, and it is improving, get better at telling the difference between what Judge Teskey in Clayton County used to call the scary things that kids might do and the annoying things that kids might do. And the annoying things lead a lot of kids into the school to prison pipeline. I mean, thousands of them. But again, to Adam's point too, there are some trends that are positive. It's important to note that there have been improvements about things. So for example, since 2011, we have gone from an 11% suspension expulsion rate in the state to 5% last year. Now, last year was a special year, but it still dropped down to about 6%. That's really important. That's like 45,000 fewer kids every year, even though the population has increased, are being suspended or expelled. That is because people like the folks in this phone call went to their schools and said, this is crazy. Like, this is crazy. They went to our website, or they went to the governor's office website, goes to the governor's office of student achievement, and they looked at the rates. And they said, holy cow, 11% of our kids are being suspended. 13% of Black children are being suspended in 2011, right? Only 4% of white kids. And they said, we've got to change. And there's been some reforms over the years that have tracked actually the criminal justice reform movement in Georgia as well. And in Georgia now, those numbers are down. They're better. It's still a shocking number. But even again, sort of the racial disparities, it's down to 8.5% for Black children, and the number for white children has stayed in the upper 3s. So the disparity has reduced as well, which to me demonstrates that, the system was not fair. It wasn't just that we're disciplining fewer kids. There's a problem with the way that we discipline children. 2 important facts to me. 1, it didn't used to be this way, and kids are not worse than they were before. And 2, if you can reduce the number, why are the disparities? Why is it narrowing so much? If you could do some targeted things over the last 10 years that made this big of a difference, that means there's real hope for the future. You can continue to adopt these policies and these practices in schools, and it will reduce the number of kids who are kicked out of school. And that has had a direct impact in our juvenile justice arrest rates, which also, unfortunately, it's very difficult to get good numbers about this, but between 2011 and 2016 dropped significantly in Georgia, significantly. And I'm hopeful that they continue to drop. It's hard to know because one of the biggest challenges in a state like Georgia and across the country is actually getting good numbers on any of this. So there are some positive trends.
Thank you, Michael. Very, very well said. I really like your story too about how things can escalate so quickly from that child that really, might have forgot a pencil, escalates quickly, up to suspension over time, just one step at a time. Very similar to the story I shared earlier about how Bob could get pulled over for a busted taillight, and it escalates to where he's into the criminal justice system. So things like it happens in small steps like that. I think Doug Amar is online with us. Is that true? Is he on now?
I think it's true. Can you hear me?
Doug, are you on with us? If you are and can hear us, do you mind taking a minute to introduce yourself?
Can you hear me, Doug?
Yes, sir.
Good. Okay. Sorry to join by phone. A lot of technical difficulties this morning. So my name is Doug Amar. I'm a lawyer. I'm the executive director of the Georgia Justice Project. We're a 35-year-old organization that's solely focused on criminal justice, both direct service, policy, and community engagement. We represent people on both criminal defense matters as well as sort of the impact of a criminal record, like expungement. And that the criminal defense work we do all over in Atlanta primarily, and our social workers follow our clients into prison and afterwards. And our criminal records work we do all over the state. And we also have a fairly new effort at a new prison in Georgia called the Metro Reentry Facility. and partnering with the Department of Corrections to help remove barriers for guys. The Department of Corrections is focused on reentering and removing those barriers before they get out. And of course, we do policy work as part of all that. And so that's a quick rendering of who we are.
Thank you, Doug, very much. Now, we've been talking a little bit, Doug, about some of the national trends across the country and how we got to some of these numbers and what's going on in the criminal justice system. Let me bring it down to kind of the state level, the state of Georgia level. And I know the Georgia Justice team does a lot of work across the state. So, Doug, while you're on, give us your thoughts on some of Georgia's most pressing issues around criminal justice. And what are some of our strengths? What are some things that you guys are seeing?
Well, let me say one of the things we've seen for years in our 35 years, over 31 years of doing this work, is that, and to sort of add on to what the other panelists have mentioned, is the criminal justice system, even with just an arrest, much less a conviction, can often be a life sentence. The impact of a record, no matter what happens on the case, and even if you're convicted, even if you never go to jail, even if you never go to prison, even if you're on probation or parole, the impact of a record is huge, and particularly around employment and housing, two of the most fundamental things folks need to be on their own and take care of themselves and their families. So I just want to point out this idea of a criminal record, and let me put in a couple data points here. 4.3 million Georgians have a criminal record, and a criminal record means you've been arrested and or convicted, but you got fingerprinted, and that number is that fingerprint's associated with the FBI. It's an all database by the state, a database by the feds. So this idea of having a record is a huge deal in this country. Roughly 25 to 30%, according to the Department of Justice, of Americans have been arrested or convicted. 1 out of every 2 kids has a parent who has a criminal record. So I just want to, one of the things we haven't talked about is sort of these lingering impacts of the criminal justice system with this massive buildup that has already been talked about, and the massive amounts of arrest and incarceration. There is this other piece that becomes a lingering tail, that the tail is probably bigger than the dog in this sense. So I want to mention that because I think one of the good things that is happening, and Doug, I think you know about this, that we've been working on for years, both from a policy side and a direct service side, is changing the law in Georgia so that people who have a criminal record, an arrest and or a conviction, that there's some path, essentially based on their rehabilitation, based on that they're not getting back in trouble, that you can go in front of a body, whether it's a judge or a prosecutor or some vehicle, and have that record not show up for the rest of your life and not impinge upon your efforts to get a job, housing, go to school, be a foster parent for your own grandparents. Some of our clients in the past have had that barrier. So around the state, I would say that's one of the things we're working around the state on that. We've actually launched the first expungement desk in the state in partnership with Cobb County. And thanks to some incredible support from the Georgia Power, we're spreading that around the state and hope to have a number of other desks in jurisdictions in the next probably 6 months to a year as we work to establish those. So that's one very encouraging piece that I would talk about. And then I would also just have to mention that another encouraging piece under Governor Deal's reform efforts is that is really around accountability courts and the idea that people who have a problem, essentially like a drug addiction or mental health problem, have another avenue, who do break the law in some way, but instead of punishing them, there's a sense in which what can we do to sort of, fix them, heal them, address the real issue, and divert them out of the system. And in Georgia, the number I often use and talk about, and this is roughly right, I hope, but when Governor Deal came into office, 11, 12 years ago, there were about less than 20 accountability courts in Georgia. By the time he left, and as we speak right now, that number is roughly 350 or so. So this has been a huge proliferation of essentially the system, mainly judges and prosecutors actually, creating another mechanism to divert people, address their underlying issues, with the whole goal, of course, that all of us care about, is folks not coming back to the system, reducing crime and increasing safety. So let me just stop there, Doug, if that's sort of what you were thinking.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that. Thank you that very much. So, we've kind of started down this path, and I know we could go in a lot of different directions. We've talked about kind of national trends, state trends. Again, we talked about the inequities in the system and how, even though that's getting better, we still got a long way to go. on correcting those issues. And there's a lot of other things we could talk about, anything from police training. We could talk about impact on veterans. We could go down all kind of particular paths. But let me, just for the sake of time today, let me hit another question on this that I think I'm seeing a lot of questions in the chat about this. So now that we've kind of laid these trends out, give us your thoughts on some potential solutions to the criminal justice issues. And I know there's not just one, there's not a silver bullet out there. So I know it by itself will not solve everything, but give us some thoughts on some potential solutions that would make things better at a state or a national level. And Pamela, if you don't mind, I'm gonna start with you on that one.
Sure. So I'm going to focus on women since that's where my work is concentrated. And again, that's where my lived experience is. So here in Georgia and nationally, as we know, the prison system basically was created for men, which is the main cause of most of the harm that's perpetuated for women who are incarcerated. We have to deal with the ideology of the prison being based on men, which means that there are a huge number of gender inequalities within the prison system, such as men's uniforms, recycled underwear, limited tip visitation, women being sentenced to being designated to places 500 miles beyond where they live at, so they're not able to get visits. With pregnant women, we're talking about inadequate perinatal care, even inadequate gynecological care for women who are not pregnant, pap smears, mammograms, those type of things that are important to women, hygiene products. Just to have to ask a male officer for hygiene products can be very embarrassing and dehumanizing for a woman. Anything, as well as here in Georgia, if you are pregnant and incarcerated, your pregnancy is induced. You don't get an opportunity to experience a natural labor, natural childbirth, unless you're fortunate enough to go into labor Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 during working hours. And then once you have your baby, you get max of 2 hours, if that, with your baby. And that often depends on the correctional staff, the staff at the hospital, if they have time. And as Adam used that magic word, discretion, everything is based on discretion. And then returning to a facility postpartum where women are sleeping on floors because of overcrowdedness, only having 2 uniforms, not being able to take a shower after you deliver your baby at the hospital, and then getting back and having to wait weeks before you can still take a shower, and walking around in soiled uniforms. It's just so many, dehumanizing things that occur. Women being in the observation of male officers when they're undressed. For myself, I miscarried. Once I arrived to the hospital, I was shackled to a bed by my arms and by my ankles. And I endured my miscarriage with 2 male officers between my legs who refused to give me any privacy. These are just regular, normal occurring things. And then being placed in solitary. Solitary confinement is a big issue. It's a torturous treatment of people. And then, like, for myself, when we think of solitary, we think of someone doing something horrendous to get themselves there. And it's as simple as, for me, I was told I was being in medical observation, but it was solitary confinement. And then I was moved to a different facility, the city facility that's known as ACDC, it's the Atlanta City Detention Center, where they house local folks for local ordinances. And there I was placed in solitary because it was for my protection, because I was considered a federal inmate. These were local inmates, and the contract did not cause for us to cohabitate together. So these are the type of things that we deal with. So here in Georgia, Restore Her has been fortunate enough to pass HB 345, which bans the shackling and solitary confinement of incarcerated pregnant women. We also have been fortunate to get this bill passed in 19 states across the nation, with the most current being North Carolina. And although we have passed legislation that is law, women are still being shackled. All of these things are still occurring, which is why we have had to make a next step. So we have come back with the Women's Care Act, CARE being an acronym for Childbirth Alternatives, Resources, and Education. And what this legislation will do, it will allow a woman, if she's arrested and remains unable to bond out for 72 hours, will be given a pregnancy test. If that test is positive, she is automatically bonded out with no questions asked. And during that time, if she's convicted and sentenced to serve time, her sentence is deferred 6 to 12 weeks postpartum. This will allow her to get the perinatal care she needs to make her own decisions about her pregnancy and how she delivers her baby. It will also allot her the time to bond with her baby, to make a decision about where her baby goes, because as it stands now, she will have 24 hours, and if not, the state takes over and these women end up losing their parental rights. So this also will save the state thousands of dollars that they spend to house these women, to pay for their medical care, to deliver these babies, and the babies that are placed in state custody, that's at a cost as well. So these are the current things that we're working on now. We were able to introduce it last session and it passed committee hearing unanimously. However, we ran out of time and did not make it to crossover. So we're expecting to come back this year and we're hoping for great things. But looking at alternative means of allowing women to hold themselves accountable for, whatever mistakes that they made is something that we really need to look at more thoroughly and start exercising. Because as we know, women are the cornerstone of the home. And most of these homes fall apart and families break apart. And as Michael was saying with the kids, this is where all of this stuff derives from, because these primary caregivers, which are the moms, are not there to do their jobs.
Excellent. Thank you, Pamela. You have an amazing way to tell a story on that, and you can just see the inhumanity in the stories that you're able to describe like that, and directly from your experiences. And we wonder why people continue to be impacted by that psychologically, and all in their families, et cetera, for years and years and years after that. So thank you for sharing that. Adam, I know you see a lot of stuff in your organizations from other states and what they're doing around criminal justice issues. Anything you want to add to that on things we can do to continue to make strides in this space? I think you're muted, Adam.
I'm back now. Sorry about that. The policy menu here, Doug, is so long. It's really hard to pick something out. But if you're asking me to pick something out, I'll pick this in terms of criminal justice reform as it's normally defined, and that would be probation and parole, the massive system that supervises 4.5 million people, as you said before. That too often acts as a tripwire that just mainlines people back into incarceration. It's moving in the right direction. It's moving in the right direction in Georgia, but still is designed mostly to catch people when they're doing wrong, as opposed to catch people when they're doing something right and incentivize them to succeed. And there are a whole number of things that are happening, including some legislation here in Georgia that allows people to earn their way off of supervision earlier. That is one of the key policy reforms. You all are frozen on my screen, so I just want to check and see if you're still hearing me.
Yes.
We're still hearing you.
Okay. I want to. Though, Doug, I want to shift gears a little bit on the question and talk about violence, because while violence and violence reduction is not normally thought of as sort of the part of the criminal justice reform sort of portfolio, I think is absolutely critical. that for us to get a handle on this violence issue and bend those numbers back down. Now I'm out.
Gotcha. Thank you, Adam. All right, Michael, how about you or Doug? Do you guys want to add anything to that on some potential solutions that we need to make sure we look at as we face these issues?
Yes, I do. I'm sure Doug does too. I shift focus a little bit to some things that we could do, again, in the prevention category to reduce the likelihood that people actually get intertwined with the system at all. Before I do that, I want to say, listening to Pamela's story, Pamela offers details, right, about what's actually happening in prisons. And I think that's really important for people to educate themselves about that. It is shocking. It will shock you what's happening. And you can be shocked without feeling like you have to immediately blame individual people or whatever. You should just learn what the situation is. And there's resources and some good journalism out there that will help you do that. And that will motivate you. It will motivate you to ask questions of your politicians, ask them what their positions are on these issues, because you've got to put pressure on them if we want some of these policy changes to happen. And also, when you get into your schools, ask them questions. So there's a couple of things I'll just put on my sort of wish list here. One is really thinking about what Pamela talked about with families and keeping families linked together. There are a lot of different ways families are separated: incarceration, foster care, things like that. And remember, even if a child needs to be removed from a home for safety, that was a traumatic event for that child. That was the family the child knew. And it has harmed the child to be removed, whether or not that was the right thing or not. Those are the facts. And so you have to do what you can. If the state's going to step in and be the parent, then it's got to be a good parent. And a good parent's going to try to make sure that child maintains communication with its family. Because the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, when you sever those relationships, bad things are going to happen to that child. Bad things are going to happen to the community, and you're going to see incarceration rates. You're going to see trouble that you may not anticipate right away. In the schools, there's a couple things I want to talk about in particular real quick. A couple things that we can do as a state and continue to improve the situation in schools. And one is a concept folks may not have heard much about. I don't have a lot of time, so I won't go into it. But school climate reform. And you'll hear about it. If you Google it, you'll see school or education climate. It's a big deal in Georgia. We've really tried to lead the nation on this and learn a lot about it. And it has caused a real reduction in how much discipline happens. And what school climate reform is about grown-ups and adults being thoughtful about the classroom, reinforcing good behavior, being clear about expectations, reducing the amount of discretion, and recognizing age-appropriate behavior for what it is, right? And then really thinking about what is annoying me and what's scaring me. What's actually causing a problem here in the classroom for learning, and what's just annoying to me. That sounds minor, but has saved 10 to 15,000 kids a year, right, from being shunted into the school to prison pipeline. So we have some state laws about that. And you can learn more about that at our website or elsewhere, and you ask your school about it. The second thing I would say is ask your politicians about school-based behavioral health services. Kids need behavioral health services in schools, and Georgia is another last, unfortunately. It is the last in the country for behavioral mental health access. It just is. And that's shocking because, as we all know, that's an increasingly important, we're all recognizing how critical that is. And Georgia has a program called APEX, to seed money to schools to allow them to have these behavioral health programs. And finally, I'll just say, focus on your foster kids. They're your kids. There's 12,500 of them. We're doing the best we can. We're representing them or finding other lawyers to represent them when they're facing suspension or expulsion. But they need our support. They need our care. They're our children. It's our duty to be good parents to those kids. So those are three areas I think that if all the listeners here learned about and asked their politicians and local schools about it, make a big difference.
Thank you, Michael. That is, I'll tell you what, I'm going to take a tape recording of that because you could not have any better explained why we as a company really link criminal justice to our whole education focus. And why it's so important to get to those kids early on in the process so you can keep them out of the criminal justice system. So thank you for that. Doug, we only have like a couple of minutes left, but I wanted to give you anything you want to add to specific solutions that you or your organization is working on.
Thank you, Doug. I will take a moment or two. And again, I'm not sure everything that was covered before, given my technical difficulties, so I might I don't know if the issue, there's a couple of things. First is the issue of correctional control. And I don't know if you talked about that and how it's embedded in what I heard part of what you said, Doug, and what Adam talked about, and that is probation and parole. Georgia leads the country on those under correctional control. And correctional control is defined as jail, prison, probation, and parole. We have 1 out of 18 Georgians who are either in jail, prison, or on probation or parole. We have the largest raw number, and of course, per capita number of folks on felony probation, roughly 200,000. There's another 25 or so thousand on felon or on parole. Folks in the system know this is a big problem. We have this biggest system that is a barrier for so many things. It becomes the tripwire you all talked about, but it also is a barrier to employment and housing. And then, so we, working with Pamela last year and a number of other groups and a number, of course, of legislators that you're familiar with, we were able to get past SB 105, which is a process that it's essentially our team working with DCS and the Prosecuting Attorneys Council came up with to really truncate the process to get people off parole or off probation faster. And meaning if they're doing well, they shouldn't be on these 20 and 30 year sentences of just reporting and paying and always having the fear that they're going to go back to jail or prison. Even this morning, I learned, DCS, Department of Community Supervision, who we work closely with on implementation of this new law, they are moving really fast and amazing results that they're going to publish very soon in terms of raw numbers. So we're excited about that, but we've got to keep moving that needle. We need not to be the nation's leader on correctional control. And lastly, Doug, if I have a moment, I would say this, is that we have a policy agenda more looking forward very proactively and very specifically that we're working with a number of the legislators on. And it's really, we're calling it Getting Georgians Back to Work. And it's about all criminal justice issues. It's about driver's license suspensions and 200,000 people in Georgia who have a suspended license for debt or missing court, which is just ridiculous. 50,000 of those folks get arrested every year. And we are trying to change that, and we're excited about moving that forward. But I also want to talk about the issue of second chance hiring, which I know Georgia Power cares about. And Ms. Ward is working on, a number of other folks in the company. And it's a big deal now because of the labor shortage. And so second chance hiring is really one of the ways that companies and our community can increase the number of people who are available to fill jobs if either we do a number of things around their criminal record. So one of our bills is to expand expungement again to keep moving that needle forward, particularly for felony convictions. And we think we're going to have some movement there. I will say that we're partnering on those issues as well as an issue around, we're partnering on issues with both the Chamber of Commerce, Metro Chamber, and the Georgia Chamber, and a number of other companies, because they see it as an employment issue. They see the intersection of the criminal justice system with employment, and that's why I think we've been able to get more folks involved, like Georgia Power, to help all of us move the needle forward. So we're excited about that this coming year, and we'd love some additional support in the ways individuals might want to show up. Thanks.
Thank you, Doug, very much. And let me just pause here and just thank Pamela, Michael, Doug, and Adam. But really appreciate you guys being with us today. You really help us set a foundation for our employees to help them understand why our company is focusing on criminal justice as part of our social justice strategy. And that was a great foundation for us. It's the first broad discussion that we've had about why we're doing that. And I could not have asked for a better foundation that was laid. So thank you for that. I also want to thank all of you for the partnerships that you've established with our company to help us understand how to impact this in the best way moving forward. And we just look forward to continuing those partnerships and expanding them in the future. And we'll be calling on you for other ideas on how we can continue to help our communities, our families, and these individuals work through this in a better way in the future. So thanks again. Thank you for being with us today. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Rosa or Charmaine.
All right, I think I'm story of my life. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. Thank you, Doug. Amazing job as a moderator, and thank you to all of our panelists for joining us today. I appreciate your participation and questions, and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday, November 17th, for our next social justice webinar, which will be focused on energy justice. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.